All right, hello everyone. This is somewhat impromptu, but due to unforeseen circumstances, I've been forced to record the final lecture for this course, and it is on the topic of animals in sport. Just before I delve into it, I will of course issue an announcement or an email or whatnot, just explaining the situation, but basically I have to attend a function on Monday. This is something which I cannot avoid, unfortunately. This is the timing is arranged through the faculty, so unfortunately, as I say, I can't actually be in the lecture theatre live next week. So again, I will obviously make an announcement, so please don't show up to the lecture theatre because there'll be no one there. But yeah, I do apologise again for the inconvenience. It is completely unavoidable. But in any event, I think you'll find that this topic is exceptionally interesting, if only because it involves animals and I love animals. But you find it perhaps a little intriguing to know that in a lot of sports law courses around the country, animals in sport barely features. I find that a little staggering, to be honest, if only because animals play such a large role in a significant number of sports, but also because I think animals in sport is one of those very pressing issues that attracts a number of different lines of inquiry, particularly along sort of moral lines. As in, I don't think there's many opportunities in any sports law courses around the country where we get to stop and think, hang on, is this actually something we should be doing? Are there better ways to do this? Are there any issues that arise, legal, moral and otherwise, that we should really stop and think about? And so I think this is a good opportunity, this particular topic, to delve into some of those issues. So to give you a bit of an outline of where we're heading with this, first of all, I do want to look very briefly at the historical involvement of animals in sport, and that really does set the scene for understanding both why we have such a passion or affinity for having animals involved in sport, but also why we go to such measures as we do now in terms of protecting their welfare. And also making sure that anyone who violates the rights of animals is treated appropriately or punished accordingly. I also want to look at the legal regulation of sports involving animals, and obviously that is an area of focus for us, and it will be where I do most of the talking in terms of how we deal with wrongdoers, people who obviously violate community standards, violate the laws and regulations in place with respect to animal welfare in sport. So we'll go through all of that as well. I also want to look at a couple of moral and ethical debates that, as I mentioned a few moments ago, quite clearly arise in this space because we are involving a whole different species, or number of species, in sport, which is obviously something human beings have done for recreational means for centuries. So this is obviously, as I say, a good forum for us to think about some of those what can be difficult concepts, ethical concepts about having animals involved in sport. And finally, I'll look at a few of the current controversies, or relatively current controversies, not so much about animal welfare generally. I mean, you will have seen some really horrific tales in the news recently, people being arrested and charged for animal cruelty offences. The most recent I can think of was only a few weeks ago, those guys who were booked for committing unspeakable acts against that poor little kangaroo, or there were a number of kangaroos, I believe, who were viciously stabbed. It was horrible. And of course, the police have moved swiftly to arrest those gentlemen after they were identified. And I shouldn't even call them gentlemen because it was quite truly horrific what occurred there. And we don't obviously want to see anything of that scale involved in sport, and we probably won't, but we will. When I say probably won't, we only see what the cameras show us. But of course we all know that animal cruelty has in the past been perpetrated on quite horrifically large scales in sport. And again, I think we're just, or rather the wrongdoers are just fortunate that it's not come to light. Well, that's all changing. The era of social media has made it even more difficult, I think, to escape public scrutiny, and certainly gives the law enforcement agencies a leg up when they're looking for leads. So we will look at a few controversies in the specific context of animals in sport and some of the welfare violation cases and whatnot that have arisen there. All right, so let's kick off with the historical context then, which lays the foundation for the rest of our discussion. So animals in sport, it is not a unique concept at all, and I did say centuries, I should probably have said millennia more accurately. That is the sort of time period we're talking about in terms of animal involvement in human sports. There are cave paintings dating as far back as the Paleolithic era which depict hunting activities involving wild animals. And you might remember way back in week 1 we were talking about how Australia's sporting culture has developed, how it has, and a large part of that comes from the fact that sport was once something we literally did for survival. Hunting and gathering, fishing. These were quite literally activities that helped us survive and thrive as a species. So no surprise then that hunting was depicted, and of course, loosely speaking, it is a form of sporting activity. But then coming a little further forward, in ancient Roman and Greek times, you had horses being used for chariots, chariot racing, you had jousting tournaments, of course, particularly with medieval knights, very common. And again, if you move closer and closer to home, there was pigeon racing in, 1,000 years before Christ. There was polo in the 6th century. There was dog racing in the early 19th century. So, you can see that no matter how far back you go, as far as records show, animals have been involved in sport. And of course, if you go even further back, we see all sorts of historical depictions of different kinds of sport being played. But yeah, it's obviously, I think, quite important that animals obviously feature in that picture as well. So, raises an interesting point. Why do we actually do this? Why do we even involve animals in sport? Why were our historical predecessors, our ancestors, why were they so focused or obsessed with having animals involved in sport in the first place? So much so that they're depicted in a lot of ancient artworks and prehistoric artworks. Well, there's a couple of ways to look about this particular question. A great little quote from Webster. There's the full citation, I think, is on the next slide, I'm pretty sure. But it's a nice little quote. Those who seek to justify animal sports must accept at the outset that they do these things because, to them, it is good fun. And I think that comment really does capture probably a large sort of cross-section of the community's attitudes as to why we do this. It's because we like doing it. We like seeing horses and dogs race. We like seeing pigeons, whatever it is. We like seeing it. It's just something different. It's novel, and again, it involves entirely different species. So it's just something different to seeing humans sort of combat with one another in a competitive setting. We've now thrown animals into the mix as well. It's also, we do this as well for satisfaction or reward. So obviously, as with all sports involving human actors, there's a reward that comes with successes with animal sports as well. So, if you're a part owner of Maccabi Diva, you're laughing because, there's enormous money, of course, in a successful animal. But there's also money in the various different roles that come with sport as well. So, you can gain satisfaction simply by being a trainer for a particular animal, or being responsible for their welfare, their medical care, or as a vet, serving or assisting animals involved in sport. So there are a lot of different ways that people draw satisfaction from seeing animals involved in sport and being involved personally. But yeah, mainly I think it's because of the reward, as we looked at in week 3. Huge money in sport equals huge satisfaction upon winning. And that sort of ties in with the third point I put there, which is, the emotion of gambling, or the excitement of the wager, the thrill of the win. As long as we've got competition, we've got an ample grounding for gambling. Okay, so investment, emotional and financial as well. So no surprises there that animals then make a an obvious choice for something to throw into the mix to make, you know, the sort of gambling and excitement side of it even more interesting. And then, of course, there is a socio-biological basis for involving animals in sport, and that is, you know, we have this primitive need deep down to do so, i.e., you know, we've emerged as a species to the top of the food chain alongside a lot of these smaller species, these other animals and whatnot. We've developed, in a lot of cases, an affinity with these animals, you know, particularly, of course, the more domesticated species, dogs and cats. But there's something about that, okay? We are motivated to involve animals in our lives, whether that be our personal lives, you know, having a pet to come home to, or, you know, to run along the beach with, right through to, you know, having them involved in the sports that we play, so the recreational activities in which we partake. So there's a number of different reasons, I think, that we involve animal in sport, but if you had to pick any of them, you know, as a layperson out there, the most obvious reason I think a lot of people would say is it's just, you know, it's fun to watch, you know, a horse race, or, you know, have a float on the Melbourne Cup or whatever, because that's what we know. It's just something we've always done. So I guess that is perhaps a fifth point, which is we've always done it. We've always involved animals in sport. And the interesting point of distinction when we're considering animals in sport is that, you know, we're looking at it from obviously our perspective as human beings. Seldom do we consider it from the animal's perspective, and again we'll touch on this a bit more when we look at welfare specifically. But an interesting quote again from Webster in a 2000 publication really sums this up. You know, animal sports, obviously we're still talking about competition, and again the first image that comes to mind is competition between animals. But of course competition in this context can arise between animals and humans. The difference is in the costs or benefits to the animals for the contest itself, and of course the penalties of losing. So, you know, for a human being, you know, the penalties of losing, for example, you know, there might be a financial loss or whatnot, and, you know, you might have hurt feelings because, you know, your animal came last or whatnot, but that's about as far as the loss goes, or the, you know, the cost of losing, the penalty of losing. It's very different in the context of animals, you know, and so that's why I include Webster's quote here, because I think it's just a nice, or rather a different way of looking at this issue, you know. So to a horse, this was the example that's used, the race itself carries little cost, and again we'll talk about this later, but horses generally, biologically, are engineered for this sort of thing. They actually enjoy, you know, racing and running, and you know, it's something that's in their blood, unless of course it's unlucky enough to be injured. And then, you know, for the horse itself, there'd be no immediate penalty as such for losing, you know, assuming of course there's no injury and it's cared for, and you know, the rider properly and correctly rides the animal, then there's usually no issue. Now in other sports, okay, for example, fox hunt, which is you know, along with other forms of captivity release hunting and whatnot, are largely banned. But in a fox hunt, the cost of the event to the fox depends on how hard the chase is, and the penalty for losing is death. So, you know, that's a pretty significant consequence, obviously. But we don't really consider that. You know, we look sort of at the first stage, which is, hey, we're participating in sport and there's animals involved, and we sort of stop there when, you know, we don't really turn our minds to the consequences. And I mean, it's probably more common in other jurisdictions, not so much here, but, you know, hunting is, for example, part of the American way of life, particularly in the South. I spent a lot of time there last year for work, and it was just quite striking how sort of casually they talk about this, about hunting and whatnot. And yeah, it's quite obvious it's a cultural issue, you know. And I don't think that there was as much emphasis upon the consequences for the animals. In fact, there was close to none. And it's not to cast aspersions on our American friends, certainly not. They were wonderful people. And they, of course, I don't think you'd find a group so affectionately attached to their domestic animals either. They just absolutely adore their domestic animals. I just saw a little bit of an interesting distinction then when there's talk of hunting and whatnot. But I say all this anyway, just basically to make the point that, there's different perspectives here, and, the whole idea of animal welfare law is to focus on perhaps the latter, to focus on those consequences and the animal's perspectives. Which is a beautiful segue, actually, into regulation itself. So, many sports, contemporary sports, involve animals, and of course they attract legal regulation as a consequence. Now, the most common ones you can see are obviously horse and dog racing, but as you move further down, particularly if you look throughout parts of the northern hemisphere, sports like bullfighting are also very, very popular, and polo. Fishing's an interesting one because, we don't really regard it as a sport as such, but more something we do, when we've got a few annual leave days or a weekend free, or you go on a trip or something. But of course it is a sport, and it's a very, very popular one that I'm particularly poor at. Wish I was better. But needless to say, there's actually more, sports than we think that do involve animals of all shapes and sizes. And you remember from week 7, we looked at this briefly when we were talking about, violence in sport and, how instances of violence are addressed, and illegality obviously concerns the extent of violence perpetrated, but also sports themselves. So certain sports or incidental activities are illegal, and you might remember that from when we talked about it in week 7. Some of them, obviously, cockfighting, captivity release hunting, which I mentioned a moment ago, live baiting, and organised animal fights. These are just some of the examples, but, we do not, as a society and as a legal system, condone those activities and sports, if we can call them that, and rightfully so, because it's just awful for the animals, because obviously death and serious injury often ensues. So how are animal sports regulated? Well, there's a couple of major pieces of, or major statutory instruments here. So one, of course, is an act of Parliament legislation. It's the Animal Welfare Act of 1985. And then the regulations beneath it from 2012, they've been updated a few times, but they basically, like with all regulations or delegated legislation, just add another layer upon the primary legislation. There are also other acts and regulations which operate throughout the rest of the country, but essentially they all sing the same song, which is, these particular sports and activities are banned, these ones are regulated, and here's how. And of course, perhaps one of the more prominent features are the penalties that attach for violation of those rules and regulations. So just to kick off with, and of course I'll be focusing on the South Australian position, but you'll notice throughout all the other states and territories there's equivalent provisions in the equivalent acts. But Section 14 of the Animal Welfare Act in South Australia lists off sort of the penalties for what's termed prohibited activities, and we'll talk about this a little bit more shortly. But I have highlighted there the penalties because I think that's worth talking about, at least for a moment. So the maximum penalty for taking part in a prohibited activity is $50,000 or imprisonment for 4 years. Now, they have been increased, those penalties, but there are calls to take them even further. And again, this is a point we'll talk about again shortly, but you'll notice that we're talking significant financial penalties and possibly penalties against your liberty if you're imprisoned. And then you'll notice subsection 2 there. Okay, you must not be present in a place which are prohibited activities occurring. And I think that's important to note too, because look at the penalties there, $20,000 or imprisonment for 2 years. That's just for being present in a place where this stuff is taking place. Now, if I was doing this live, I would ask the question at this point, why would that be? Okay, why would just being present there result in significant penalties, a little under half of the maximum for actually taking part in those activities? And I suppose the obvious answer is, well, that's just as bad, isn't it? Even though you might not have your hand on the whip, you're there savouring that particular activity, you're supporting it, whether directly or indirectly. And of course, this all turns on whether or not you're aware these activities are taking place, but it'd be hard to miss, for example, an organised animal fight. And so I think that's sort of sending a powerful message. That's Parliament saying, hey, we take this very seriously. Okay, animal welfare protection extends not only to those who are perpetrating wrong, but also supporting it. Sorry, I was about to change the slide, but it might also be worth mentioning just subsection 3 there. So if a person is present at a place in which prohibited activity has occurred within the preceding 2 hours, they will, in the absence of proof, be taken to have been at the place at the time the prohibited activity occurred. And of course there are defences available, so if the defendant can prove they didn't know and could not reasonably be expected to have known that the activity was taking place, that is a complete defence. And again, I think it'd be hard to miss, okay, and not to notice particular activities which we'll come to see are normally of a large enough scale that, again, it would be very difficult to miss, but it is theoretically possible, particularly, of course, if it's being, disguised or hidden in, sort of underground layers, fight club style, which is traditionally what happens with cockfighting, because obviously you cannot be doing this in public or at, publicly, available facilities, because people, of course, will notice. So what are those activities under section 14? Well, if you look at subsection 5, it will give you a list of examples. So obviously organised animal fights, one of the most common, live baiting, which was a feature which, which was an activity which featured significantly in the New South Wales Greyhound Racing report or inquiry, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. Releasing an animal from captivity for the purposes of being hunted or killed, whether by a person or otherwise. So you can't get out of it via the old loophole of, well, hang on, I didn't kill it, the large rabid dog I released did. Well, that's not going to save you either. That's still a prohibited activity. Selling or supplying an animal for any of these purposes. All right. So again, you can't be the sort saying, well, I didn't participate in the activity, I just provided the means, the animals. Well, no good there. Or keeping or preparing an animal for any of those purposes. Okay, so rearing, for example, really aggravated cocks to participate in cockfighting, obviously that is an offence too, because those animals know no better and they're bred basically to be ferocious and uncontrollably sort of angry and manic. And same goes with dogs as well. That's happened with dogs too, so we don't want to see that. So my question to you, coming back to where we were a moment ago, are the statutory penalties actually strict enough? So just let me flick back through the slides for a moment. You remember the penalties there they are. So participation, 50 grand or 4 years in prison, and 20 grand or 2 years just for being present. My question to you is, do you think those statutory penalties, do you think that they are strict enough? I'm not trying to imply that they're not. That's certainly not a rhetorical question. But it does, I think, raise a really important query in terms of, scope of protection. So yes, we do have a significant financial penalty there, and there is a term of imprisonment attached, or a potential term of imprisonment. As far as I'm aware, it hasn't always been the case that people are in prison for this sort of thing, but still, it's, I guess, obviously the potential is there. And if the offence was of significant or sufficient magnitude, it would be punishable by imprisonment. But, should we go even further? I mean, is the murder of a human being, which of course warrants life imprisonment, is that sort of equivalent to the murder of an animal, which may well just have the same level of emotional attachment from, a human party to that animal? So again, it's just a query, and I'm not trying to imply that those penalties aren't strict enough, but some people will say, well, I love my dog as much as I love my neighbour, so what's or someone closer to me in my family unit or whatnot, so what's the difference? So just continuing on with prohibited activities, what does it mean to take part in a prohibited activity? Okay, so again, that is a term of potentially wide scope. Well, section 14 subsection 6 of the Animal Welfare Act actually goes into much more detail. So you take part if you do any of one or more of the following. So, organising the activity, promoting it, allowing it to occur on premises or a place that you own or occupy. If you knowingly provide an animal or other thing which is used or intended to be used for those activities, so providing equipment, things like that, or undertaking without any excuse, lawful excuse, any other activity relating to the prohibited activity. So basically, there's no way to slip through the net here. Okay, anything that you do, directly or indirectly, so as to facilitate, support, or engage actively in the prohibited activities, is going to see you be captured under section 14.6. Prohibited items. Possessing certain things, certain items in illegal animal sports is also an offence, so it's a bit of a double whammy. Not only can you be done for actually participating in or being present in the presence of those activities or sports, it's also an offence to in any way possess some of these items. So if you look in the Animal Welfare Act, this is a relatively new regulation, which is relatively new provision, which is section 14A of the Act, and you'll see there anything in the nature of these things, so cockfighting spurs, attachments for inciting animals to fight, again quite common with cockfighting, drugs for inciting or assisting animals to fight, so anything to try and stimulate them, pep them up and make them more aggressive, and lures or baits, including animal carcasses for live baiting. All right, so we don't want to see any of these things. If you're found to be in any possession of any of those, you have committed another offence as well, which is possession of those items. So I think there are some obvious parallels between offences relating to prohibited activities involving animals and offences relating to the ill treatment of animals. And there's an obvious overlap there as well. You notice in the Animal Welfare Act and the regulations that particular sort of activities, for lack of a better word, or certain acts committed against animals, which would otherwise be regarded as ill treatment, can in theory be sort of validated or permitted, provided they're performed with veterinary certification, or of course ideally by the vets themselves, the veterinary specialists and experts. So some examples there. Okay, surgically altering vocal cords, docking tails for dogs, very common. Cropping ears, nicking tails of horses or cattle, buffalo, using traps, specific gels and other substances, chemicals, etc. You can see there that obviously there is a concern to make sure that if these activities or acts are taking place, that they're taking place for a medical or psychological purpose, and that they're essential for the well-being of the animal, and hence why there's such a requirement for veterinary certification. Also, the use of electrical shock devices. You can see provisions in the Act and in the regulations regarding that as well. And of course, you can imagine the potential for abuse there for things like electric prods and whatnot, because of course it has the capacity to cause significant damage to the animal, both psychologically and physically. Now, it's important to say, look, not all sports involving animals are illegal. Now, that seems like a basic statement, and a very obvious statement, and yes, it is, but it's interesting that the first thing that often comes to mind when we talk about having animals involved in sport is you often have small factions of society say that shouldn't be the case at all. That animals should not be involved, it's against their will, they don't want to be there, etc. We'll get into the ethics of it shortly, but the humane treatment of animals is as critically important. So we're not just talking about keeping animals out of sports which are illegal. Obviously we want to do that, but in those sports which are legal, having animals involved there, we need to ensure that they are treated humanely, and that they're not experiencing any kind of excessive or severe pain or discomfort. Individual animal sports, well, they're pretty much autonomous in the sense that most of them develop their own rules and regs which govern the treatment of their respective animals. And again, I will provide a few examples for you. I think one of the most common that people know about the rules of racing. So with horses, the use of whips and whatnot, always a lot of controversy about that. So I thought I'd give you a little example here. This is from Racing Australia, courtesy of. So the Australian Rules of Racing, this is Rule 137A4. Stewards may penalise any rider who uses their whip in any of the following ways or positions. So you'll notice on that list, just going further down, using an action that raises their arm above shoulder height, All right. So in other words, we don't want people absolutely wrenching their arm and giving the horse an almighty whip, which might actually cause it injury and will certainly hurt. Because in most instances, believe it or not, the horse, the whip itself, it's normally the sound which is actually frightening the horse and encouraging it to run faster. There will, of course, be contact, but I can tell you that, from speaking to people I know, obviously, who are veterinarians, that the horse, it's barely a pinch on a horse. The whips that are used, as long as they're used correctly, on the hind of the animal will cause it certainly no major discomfort. In fact, hardly any. The hind of the horse is exceptionally strong and muscular, and to be equivalent. One person I know who I was talking to said it's the equivalent of someone flicking you on the arm, that sort of thing. But of course, if the correct technique is not used, for example, raising the arm above shoulder height, will obviously give you a little more velocity, and certainly the angle will increase or amplify the strength of the strike. Obviously, that could actually hurt the animal. So that's obviously something which is important to make sure that we don't do that. There are penalties, of course, for violating those rules and regulations. Some interesting other ones there that you'll notice. Okay, after passing the post, you obviously can't continue striking the animal, whipping the animal, if the horse has no reasonable prospect of improving or losing its position. Okay, so you can't just be doing it for the sake of it. Okay, if you're clearly out of the race, or if you're not realistically at risk of losing your position, then the rules of racing actually prohibit you from using your whip in those instances. This is an example from the APRA bylaws and comp rules. This is the Professional Rodeo Association. You can see there's a couple of really important rules. 33.6 I'm going to point out especially. Right, no animal shall be beaten, mutilated or cruelly prodded. Standard electric prods shall be used as little as possible. Now, in that particular industry, they are used perhaps a little more than even they would like, but that's because you're dealing with very large and aggressive animals. Sometimes it is exceptionally difficult to make them move, and so, desperate times, desperate measures. But you'll notice the qualification there. Animals shall be touched only on the hip or shoulder area with the prod. And again, that's because they're very strong, muscular areas, okay, densely packed with muscle fibre, so it's less likely in those instances to cause the animal any kind of injury or discomfort. So another question for you at this point. Do you think that internal comp rules like that, and the regulations obviously that follow, aptly protect sporting animals against harm? And again, it's just an open question. I don't expect an answer, and I'm certainly not going to get one given this is a recording, unless I speak to you again between now and next week. But even afterwards, I'd be more than happy to engage in discussion about this, because I'm interested to know your views on it. A lot of these rules are quite technical, and I mean, you notice, I don't know if you saw on the previous page, but particularly the racing rules, okay, that part there about using the whip correctly or incorrectly, in the rules of racing, that's rule 137, so it took that long to get to what would be regarded probably as one of the first things to talk about, and that's whipping the horse. So they are quite detailed instruments is what I'm getting at. No sporting code or industry or other regulatory body skims on the rules when it comes to animal cruelty. They can't, okay, because they're as concerned with the welfare of the animals as as the people who ride them or fly them, use them, whatnot. And it's essential, obviously, that they are concerned in that regard. So it's an open-ended question, and some people will straight away say no. There, a lot of animal rights, protectionists and whatnot will be the first to say. No, that I suppose at the more extreme ends, they'll say that animals shouldn't be involved at all. But again, I don't plan to foray into all of those arguments just now. And look, if these do provide for the types of treatment prohibited by law, should the law enforcement agencies become involved? So should we leave the particular sports or agencies or whatnot to their own devices? Should we basically say, look, if you detect something that's wrong, you penalise it, according to your own rules and regs? Well, we're coming back to where we were when we looked at sporting violence. Okay, yes, there are tribunals and whatnot which can make decisions about on-field or on-court violence, but it's possible for the law to be breached at the same time. in which case law enforcement can theoretically become involved too. You know, if it goes so far beyond the rules, has it suddenly become a criminal matter? It's always technical, it's always case by case, but you know, it has to be the analysis that we undertake, particularly if there's harm that's occurred. So I'm just going to briefly run through a few of the moral and ethical debates that arise in this space, and there are many of them. And there's a number of important questions which we will ask and which we have to ask. I think the top one there is probably the most controversial of all. Do animals have rights? And if so, what are they? I suppose the related question underneath is, you know, even if they do have rights, should they? Should they have rights? Look, I guess if you look at it from a purely regulatory perspective, then I would say that yes, animals certainly do have rights, and they're protected well, directly through animal welfare legislation. There's another perspective, way of looking at it, and that's saying that's not enforcing the animal's rights. That's just enforcing a human standard for those animals. So in other words, it's not directly enforcing their right at all. It's punishing the wrongdoers for hurting them. But you know, there's no. I guess the dialogue is not on the basis of the animal's rights. It's on the basis of the law being violated. So I guess it's a semantic issue, but basically the discourse isn't focused again on the rights of the animal. You know, you could say that it doesn't matter because we end up in the same space, which is people being penalised for animal cruelty. But you know, it is important, obviously, particularly for those you know, for animal protection groups and whatnot, because it's justifying. It's justifying you know, such a heavy-handed approach, and maybe if you ask a lot of them, you know, we're being too light-handed in that regard. So do animals matter is another big question in the sporting context. You know, are they just there? Are they just, you know, something that we use? You know, which is a horrible way to express it, but to some, that is the case. Okay, animals are there because we put them there. We're the dominant species on the planet, and therefore their role in sport is to entertain and to win for obviously their owners. So that's, you know, these are some of those really tricky questions. Again, it does come down to who you're obviously asking. The last one there, you know, what should the law's role be regarding those internally regulated animal sports? Well, that's sort of where we were heading before. You know, are we expecting the law to take a more heavy-handed approach and be more sort of inquisitorial in the sense that, you know, maybe there's more of an active role on the part of law enforcement to, you know, take control or punishment of, you know, offenders out of the hands of these bodies, of these sporting bodies? You know, should law enforcement be the ones basically who determine the full extent of all penalties for mistreatment of animals? So just coming back to the concept of rights, you know, if you look in the dictionary, it'll tell you it's, you know, a right. It's basically a moral or legal entitlement to have or to do something, and obviously that is very much framed by normative principles. Okay, so it's a very subjective concept, of course, but the significance of attaching rights to someone or thing is that it confers legal personality. And, you know, one way to look at it as well is, you know, this is something which we have ourselves generated as a concept, therefore it's a social construct. So maybe we are the ones who determine both the extent of the rights and who receives them, you know. So I'm sort of going against the natural law theorists here and saying, well, you don't have a divine right of any kind. This is something which we have imposed as humans in our legal and social order. So looking on the pro-rights movement for animals, okay, and again, this is sort of in line with what natural law theorists would say, and that is the fact that you're what Reagan has beautifully summed up as the subject of a life means that you have rights that cannot be taken away. So I think that's a really, as I said, elegant way of putting it. And Tom Reagan's written a lot in this space as well in terms of, you know, the rights of animals. But it basically is saying that the fact, as I say, that you have sentience, you have, if you want to call it, a soul. All right, the fact that you have a life means that rights attach. And again, there is a contrary school of thought, you know, because theoretically that principle goes right down to the most, you know, microbiological level of, you know, organisms, bacteria, right up to, you know, or right through to animals as minuscule as ants, you know. I guess, again, it's tricky because there's no sort of right or wrong answer here, but again, there's different perspectives on this point. I believe this is a quote from Reagan as well, if the subjects of life can't make moral choices or talk like humans, then what happens to them matters to them. Even though obviously there are key differences between animals and humans, and then of course we are the only ones who are able to communicate as we do. But even if they cannot do that, these animals, okay, they have moral rights because what happens to them obviously concerns and affects them. All right, you can hear an animal whimper if it's hurt, just like you would hear a human cry out or tell you if they were suffering. So in that respect, they should have rights because it's no different to the reaction that a human being would have. Just continuing on with the pro-rights discussion. Richard Ryder was one of the pioneers of a movement which it started in the, I'd say the early 1970s, but speciesism, it's difficult to say, don't try and say that 3 times fast, but speciesism basically says it's discriminatory, okay, to decide on, who is entitled to rights and who isn't, based solely on your special placement in the chain of evolution. So, saying to an animal who's lower on the food chain or in the developmental phase of life that, because of where you are, you have a lower status and you don't actually receive any particular moral or other rights, that's seen as discriminatory. And if you look at different references, one of which I've included here, or commentators, they'll tell you there's a lack of logic in that. Okay, because we accept as human beings that it's wrong to deliberately inflict suffering on other humans. So it must be a logical corollary to regard it as wrong to inflict suffering on innocent individuals of other species. And this is, again, a school of thought which is very much came to its ascendancy in the 70s, but right through until today, there's still, that influence from the speciesists, if I can call them that, because it's to some extent true. There is a lack of logic there, because we think it's abhorrent to injure or worse, to kill a fellow human being, and we punish it accordingly with imprisonment in most cases. So why don't we do the same when it comes to animals, animals of other species? Well, in response to that, critics will say, well, hang on a minute, animals don't actually have that sentience, that consciousness that humans do. Right? And again, this can be debated quite hotly, and it is. But, the argument is that animals don't think like we do, and that therefore they can't have the same rights. The second point, the animals not having souls, is quite contentious, and that often touches on some, draws on religious inspiration and literature and whatnot. There's an argument that animals lack the capacity for free moral judgment, which I suppose is tying in with the first point. They just don't have that level of sentience that we do. They can't make moral decisions. They can't understand right from wrong. Okay, although, if you've owned a pet before, particularly a dog, they'll tell you, or you'll, certainly be able to tell that they can tell right from wrong and when they're in trouble. So I think in that respect, some of the critics' arguments, it's a bit of a tennis match. You can go back and forth, but you can see, certainly you can appreciate like where the pro-rights activists are coming from, or, adherents, and where the critics are coming from too. Because look, I'm not trying to push one agenda or the other, but I mean, my personal view is, animals, they're special to us. They're a part of our lives. They're a part of our evolution as a species on this planet, and that therefore, we should absolutely afford them with at least basic rights and appreciate that they are living creatures at the end of the day, which sort of runs contrary to that last point, which is that animals are purely instinctive, whereas humans can think rationally and employ logical thought. Well, look, some human beings I know aren't entirely logical at all. So I suppose, to sort of counter that critic's point there, it's not always the case that logic is what separates the species. Yes, we are by far the most intelligent species on the planet, although some people, some people, particularly in high-ranking positions around the world, they make you query that theory. But no, needless to say, yes, we are the most dominant and intelligent, and obviously we've earned our way up to the top. But at the same time, I don't think we can say animals are, entirely instinctive, because there are obviously occasions where that's been proven or disproven in various ways. But look, this is quite circular in the sense that you can go back and forth for ages. And I mean, just looking a little further on, there are different critics saying different things. It's not just animals shouldn't have rights, it's animals shouldn't have rights because of X. The social contract theorists such as Scruton say, well, they can't enter into what we deem the social contract, so they can't have rights, i.e. you can't integrate fully into society as a productive member of our economy. You can't enter into any kind of arrangement. So not just contract in the strict legal sense, but contract in the sense of, your place in society. You can't play the part that a human being can, basically. You can't form that relationship with the state. The utilitarians such as Frey will say, well, we just need to avoid unnecessary suffering, definitely, but ultimately human beings are top of the food chain. Therefore, animals are, or any other animals, are subservient to the rights of humans. So again, it depends also on who you ask. Okay, there are very different schools of thought in this regard. To try and rationalise that concept of animals having rights, okay, St. Thomas Aquinas, centuries ago says humans have a duty to be charitable to animals, only so as to discourage any cruel behaviours being exacted against humans. This was a concept referred to as transference. So in other words, there is a value in being nice to animals and avoiding any kind of cruelty and penalising cruelty towards animals, because that indirectly conditions human beings, okay, and influences how they treat one another. And there's similar sort of language from another commentator here, Gary Francione, who basically says the same thing but frames it in the context of legal welfarism. So it's sort of this communal effort to protect, humanity, obviously, but part of that stems from, the benefits of treating each other nicely, including animals. So there's basically a net benefit, in other words, of looking after the welfare of animals, because it does so, or it has benefits to the wider community as well. So a similar sort of theory to Aquinas, but it's rationalised slightly differently. But there is an obvious ethical conundrum. If animals have rights, can they exercise them? Now, I've got a great little quote here from Scruton, which basically touches on this. Think about the consequences of attributing, extensive rights to animals, because that means we have to, all of a sudden, imbue them with rights which touch upon concepts such as consent. Can we actually get the consent of an animal for various activities? Should we do this? Do we need to ask permission to train them or to have them participate in races? How do we do that? I mean, we're talking about talking to animals, okay, and so far only Dr. Doodle and Dr. Harry are the only people I know that can do that. All right, there's just no way that we could possibly do it. Well, certainly not, in the orthodox sense, so we'd have to think of another way. But these are some of the issues that arise in this space, and some of the questions which flow on from, that attribution of rights. And it's not to say we shouldn't do it, but it's important that we consider those questions, because there are ramifications for attribution of rights to anything, any living organism whatsoever. Feinberg draws a really interesting distinction, yet another commentator, between hurt and harm. So starts out with the proposition that yes, obviously there's always some morally wrongful aspect to, having animals involved in sport if they're injured or if they're in any way discomforted. Okay, let's be honest, a horse will probably prefer not to have someone on its back than to have someone on its back. But of course we all do it. Well, when I say we all do it, society accepts that, riding and racing horses is the norm. Well, Feinberg draws a distinction between hurt and harm. He says hurt is okay, hence why it's in green there, in the sense that it does not impede their welfare interest. Their welfare interest, of course, well, being twofold. One, of course, from the animal's perspective is they're not in any way injured significantly, and at the same time, human beings can enjoy the benefit of having those animals involved in a particular sport. So in that regard, there's no injury to the welfare, the broader welfare interests of both the animal and society. Now that's different to harm. Harm does impede that welfare interest because, again, from the animal's perspective, obviously they suffer because they're hurt physically, emotionally, and that impedes the welfare interest of broader society because if the animals are hurt or killed, obviously they cannot participate in sport. Obviously, attitudes, social attitudes will change. Certainly if we're seeing more and more animals injured or killed, that's not something we want. And again, coming back to the biological basis for doing things like riding horses, well, there's a large body of literature which says that it's not actually causing them any harm because, again, talking in evolutionary terms, horses have done this for centuries, for millennia. Animals have been hunting for millennia. Pigeons have been, other birds have been required to fly for millennia. Fish have been caught for millennia. This is something we've always done. So in that regard, yes, they might be hurt, but that's not impeding the welfare interest, whereas harm is. That's just another way of looking at it. So basically, the law restricts autonomy, and therefore it should be applied sparingly. And that's really important to validate, how the law actually applies. We need to distinguish harm from hurt. So that's one way of looking at it. But my question to you, does sport merely hurt, or does it actually harm? Okay, is it impeding the animal's welfare interest? And that's an important point because you could say, hurt is still harm. Even if we're not talking any long-standing injury, even if, yes, they'll be fine in a couple of days, the medical evidence says so, does that mean we should be doing it? Okay, does that mean that it's still in the animal's welfare interest if, even for a short period of time, they're experiencing short-term pain? It's a legitimate question. And again, I don't have an answer to it, but I do put it to you because it sort of crosses both boundaries here between, animal legal rights activists who will say absolutely causes hurt and harm and we shouldn't do it at all, versus the critics who say, well, animals, it's always been a thing, it's always been something they're prepared for, that they do. In the case of horses, they're quite literally biologically designed to do this. So, what's the deal? What's the problem? Again, very, very difficult to reconcile all of these views. The last thing I want to talk about very briefly is a couple of current controversies in this space, so animal welfare and animal involvement in sport. The most famous one, of course, was, in recent times at least, the New South Wales Greyhound saga. So you might recall, for those of you who know, back in 2015, early 2015, there were allegations of animal cruelty in the Australian racing industry, greyhound racing industry. And there were various rumours emerging from, both disgruntled or disheartened members of the industry regarding things like live baiting, killing and shipping greyhounds who were deemed to be inadequate or too slow. Images started surfacing on social media, reports, investigative journalists got involved. All of a sudden, a special commission and inquiry was triggered to address those allegations, and in May of 2015, the inquiry commenced, and the report was handed down a little over a year later. The Premier, New South Wales Premier, then Mike Baird, actually went as far as banning the industry altogether. Passed legislation which quite literally abolished the industry. Now that was to take effect from 1st of July last year, at least it was. Key findings of that inquiry: wastage was horrendous, wastage in the sense of death, animal deaths. It was quite literally tens of thousands, most of which were actually healthy. So it was completely unnecessary what was happening. Live baiting was a common practice, even though, as we were discussing earlier, theoretically not only is it illegal, it's banned in the sport, but the dogs themselves were sustaining horrendously catastrophic injuries during the racing, and little was being done about it. So these were some of the key findings. And it's a large report. You can Google it and see it for yourself. There's more to it than that, but they were some of the key findings, and they're quite disgraceful. But then the government backflips. The reason being, industry supporters, even residents and businesses said, well, hang on a minute, this is a huge industry. And again, sort of tying back to week 3 here, with the influence of commercialism and the corporate dollar, it was such an enormous industry that even the government appreciated what everyone was saying. There was an enormous backlash. And you may even remember this, there were all sorts, petitions, rallies, even some politicians getting in on the act and saying, well, hang on a minute, maybe we've been too heavy-handed here. And hence the Premier's comments there, we underestimated the community's desire to give the greyhound industry one last chance to reform and to conform to the highest standards of animal welfare. We've heard loud and clear. And so that's exactly what they did. They did a backflip, and basically they permitted the industry to continue, provided that it basically tried to clean up its act. And there's a few of the little extracts there from the orders that we issued. So, you've got basically new sort of regulatory powers, new regulatory bodies and personnel to make sure that the industry cleans up its act. We've got different penalties, different registration processes, training, etc. So hopefully we see far less and hopefully none of what we did back in 2015 heading into the future. And finally, just the last couple of things to talk about, 2 case studies for you. So PETA last year, of course, very famous animal welfare activist group. So basically they set up a stunt where they took over the Spanish Square to make a protest against bullfighting. So there were literally hundreds of topless men and women, but mainly women, basically protesting against bullfighting. You can see there's an image there, which has been cropped, obviously, for obvious reasons. But yeah, it did make quite a statement, obviously, to have all of these people doing that. So that was one instance where PETA actually took it to the industry. And another one, this is from England, this is in October last year, but 450 birds were seized in an illegal cockfighting bust in California. Sorry, I said England, I mean California, US. There was actually a case in England about 3 weeks ago, actually, which I should have put the extract of it up. I think only charges have been laid. I don't think anything's happened since. But that was for breeding animals to fight. So a chap's been arrested there. I'll see if I can find the news report for you. But yeah, 450 game fowl for illegal cockfighting seized in Lancaster, California. So there you go. All right. That's all I have in the way of lecture slides, presentations. I would like to take this opportunity, given I won't be able to do it next week in person, at least not in the lecture. I'll try and do so in the practice session. But I do want to take this opportunity to thank you all very, very much for coming on this journey. I've very much loved teaching this subject. It's one that I'm passionate about. I enjoy the practice side of it as well. And I'm really honoured to have been able to bring this course back, because for a long time it wasn't offered in the law school for various reasons, and I'm just very happy to be able to bring it back and to be able to have you all involved in what is a wonderfully rich area of law and rapidly and exponentially growing. That comment was actually made this morning when I was at the Sport SA South Australian Sports Awards finalist presentation breakfast this morning, and that point was made by pretty much every candidate, including the Minister for Sport, who said that it is just absolutely growing exponentially. It's growing places, and the law is going to play obviously more and more of a role as it does. So thank you all very, very much again. I've very much enjoyed your company. I hope that you've taken a lot of things from this course that you've enjoyed. I look forward to reading your major research essays, and I will also be in touch, obviously, even after the course. I'd encourage you to stay in touch. That'd be great. If you ever need help with this or anything else, please let me know. But opportunities often do arise following this course for graduates, so internship, employment, there's a lot of different possibilities. So I'll keep you all posted about that. And yes, thank you very much for listening once again.